Welcome to this edition of the Committee on the Present Danger China's webinar series, specifically focused on the ongoing and indeed intensifying threat that we face from Communist China's unrestricted warfare against the United States of America. Its purpose could not be more clear. It is the destruction of America in favor of a new global superpower dominating the planet, namely the Chinese Communist Party. The President of the United States, as we speak, is poised to meet the dictator of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, on the margins of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation meetings that are taking place in South Korea this week. The agenda, we're told, will be focused on getting a new trade deal with the People's Republic of China. It has been made more urgent a matter as a result of the announcement 2 weeks or so ago by the Chinese communists that they were going to restrict exports of processed rare earth minerals, of which they have a monopoly, something on the order of 95% of such minerals, critical to most aspects of modern commerce and national security, depend critically. Getting that reversed is the object of the trade deal, evidently. The price to be paid for doing so at this moment remains to be seen. What seems, though, to be in the works is possibly a more far-reaching set of understandings with the Chinese Communist Party. The exact nature of those understandings, again, to be determined, but the object would seem to be to try to help prop up Communist China's regime, which is buffeted, as we'll be talking about with our colleagues, by myriad difficulties, both economic, demographic, and political. The question is, will President Trump, who has a record of deep concern about the Chinese communists and their agenda and activities, which have been very, I think, brilliantly described in a new book by our friend Lee Smith, prize-winning and best-selling author, in his newest book, which is entitled The China Matrix, and which talks about what has happened to our country at the hands of elites under, well, the mentoring and exemplary activities of the late Dr. Henry Kissinger. Donald Trump's concerns have informed both his candidacy for the presidency and his terms in office. We're going to discuss with our panelists whether he will hold to those concerns and the policy direction that has flowed from them, or whether perhaps he will be, as was Ronald Reagan about 49 years ago now, I think, almost 50, by Mikhail Gorbachev, the then dictator of another communist party, that of the Soviet Union, to discuss similarities between what happened when Ronald Reagan met Mikhail Gorbachev in Reykjavik, Iceland, in October of 1986, and tomorrow's meeting between President Trump and Xi Jinping. I'm very pleased to have with us a man who was in the Reagan administration, one of the most important officials responsible for executing the president's strategy for taking down the Soviet Communist Party, the evil empire, as he called it. That would be Dr. John Lenczowski. John was at the time of the initiation of that strategy and much of its execution, the director for European and Soviet affairs at the Reagan National Security Council. He's gone on to do some incredibly important work in the education field, founding, long time serving as the president and ultimately, as he is now, the chancellor of the Institute of World Politics. Absolutely sensational organization dedicated to teaching the art of statecraft in the generations that will be hopefully carrying on the fight against tyranny of whichever form it takes, including that of the Chinese Communist Party. Dr. Lenczowski, thank you. You're a late addition to this program, but it's always everybody. We put it together rather hastily, but I think urgently in light of the upcoming meeting, and we're delighted to have you provide some background on the Reykjavik 1.0 moment and whether it's apt to think of what's afoot now as possibly 2.0. Welcome back, my friend. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Frank. It's always great to be with you and with the distinguished visitors that you have here on your program. I'm very glad to be in their company. I wanted to just reflect a little bit about really a central issue that was involved both in Reykjavik and in the current situation, and that is the degree to which our presidents are possessed of what I call moral strategic clarity. There's been a lot of confusion over the years, in the last years of the Soviet Union, and even throughout this period of Xi Jinping, and certainly with Deng Xiaoping, about whether these what I consider to be totalitarian countries are actually a threat to the United States or not. There were too many people during the last years of the Soviet Union that bought into the principal Soviet strategic deception theme, which was, we are not communists anymore. We have changed. And so we are, but we are a permanent feature of the global strategic landscape, and therefore you need to just learn to get along with us, and we can come up with some kind of a proper modus vivendi, and we'll all be able to live in peace. So for years under Deng Xiaoping and his successors, the larger part of the foreign policy establishment, the academic community, certainly the business community, were convinced that the Chinese had ceased being communists. And well, now a few people have come to realize with Xi Jinping that perhaps they still are a communist country, but there are so many people who have so much of their personal business interests involved in this entire, in dealing with the trade with China, manufacturing things in China, having access to the China market, that they are putting their own private interests above the national interest. And so in Reykjavik, you had a situation where there was tremendous pressure on the president to have another successful summit meeting. And the Soviets always pushed for summit meetings. They knew that this was a form of political warfare that would redound, invariably to their benefit and to our detriment. they played the game very skillfully about raising expectations about what constitutes a successful summit. And of course, we would buy into these expectations by basically defining that success in a summit meeting means reaching an agreement, a grand deal, a big bargain, and if we didn't do it, then that would mean that we would be suffering failure in this business, and of course, all of this is part of propaganda warfare because the Soviets and the Chinese today can give us the impression that they can play on our public with their propaganda, whereas we cannot influence their public anyway in any similar fashion. It's not a reciprocal arrangement. And so in Reykjavik, you had a very unusual situation where the president had harbored rather in what I consider to have been a utopian ideal, which was getting rid of all nuclear weapons from the face of the earth. How he would succeed in doing that, maybe he could get rid of them with the Soviets, but the Chinese still had them, and there are other powers in the world that have them. So I think that this was a flight of the president's fancy. I don't know that he was particularly, cynical about putting forth an unrealizable ideal. I think he genuinely believed that this would be possible. But in the interest of having success at a summit, there was tremendous pressure on him to go along with Gorbachev's agenda, which was that we would get rid of our strategic defenses. And fortunately, the president said, no, we're not going to get rid of our strategic defenses because we can't be sure if there will be adversaries who might try to use nuclear weapons against us. But there was a tremendous pressure by the détente-oriented people in his own administration to make some kind of new deal with Gorbachev, all under the basic premise that the Soviets, were changing and had changed, and that they really didn't harbor unlimited strategic objectives, which by definition they would have to harbor if they remained communist. I should just note here that Boris Yeltsin, who was a member of the Soviet Politburo, who then underwent a conversion and a break from the party, declared after the collapse of the Soviet Union that Gorbachev's Soviet Union was a totalitarian country. And it was my view that Gorbachev was attempting to save the Soviet Union rather than to reform it in a way that would change its fundamental genetic code. So today, President Trump is in not a very easy position because Beijing has leverage over us because of our complete lack of integrated strategic thinking over the past couple of decades. Nobody in Washington was thinking about defense industrial infrastructure policy. Nobody was thinking about strategic materials policy. Nobody was worried about tens of thousands of Chinese intelligence collectors in this country. There are 25,000 of them in Silicon Valley alone. And so people just thought, oh, well, this isn't a threat anymore. And this is a complete reflection of the lack of moral strategic clarity. And so the president is under great pressure. He cannot, the fact of the matter is that he's going to have to give up something in order to ensure that Beijing can continue to send us rare earth metals wherever they have this, 90% capacity of the world's capacity for processing these rare earths. The president is going to have to play some serious catch-up ball. He's going to have to do warp speed in building that's the strategic materials, warp speed in building our Navy, and warp speed in developing new technologies, which, in my opinion, our Pentagon should be paying much more serious attention to the many small entrepreneurships out there that have excellent ideas for our national defense, analogous to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have got 500 little companies operating out of basements and garages, trying to figure out the best kind of drones there are, and the Ukrainian Defense Ministry is paying attention to all of this and taking them seriously. Here in Washington, unfortunately, everything is strangled by the big five defense contractors. And we need to be harnessing American entrepreneurship as fast as we can in all of this. So I don't know that there's going to be an immediately satisfactory result of all of this. I think there are lots of people in the business community who are breathing down the president's neck to make some kind of a happy modus vivendi with China on trade. But I think it's in the national interest that we gradually decouple from this extremely toxic relationship.
John Lachowski, thank you. What a splendid overview and a reflection of your really prized corporate memory on what has brought us to this present pass. Your service to our country in the course of the Reagan administration especially was deeply appreciated. Yuri Yermagayev was a prominent Soviet dissident during the Soviet era. He was a member of what was known as the Moscow-Helsinki Group, founded by Andrei Sakharov. In most cases, very harshly repressed by the Soviet authorities. In Yuri's case, it resulted ultimately in his being forced into exile from the Soviet Union in 1980. He came to the United States. He has been active in physics in places like MIT, Stanford University, and Belcour. Also in the financial sector, Bankers Trust and Deutsche Bank in New York City. He's never given up his commitment to human rights, however, and he has continued to work in that space, notably through the founding of the Center for Democracy in the USSR back in 1984, just 2 years before the momentous meeting that John has just described. I will say, before turning the baton over to Yuri, I was actually at Reykjavik, not in the midst of the summit meetings themselves, which were very closely held, but as part of the horse holder team, hanging with the State Department guys and trying to monitor very closely what was happening, because to the extent that, as John has indicated, the president was being tempted in exchange for this very improbable, but nonetheless desirable goal from his point of view, to rid the world of nuclear weapons, that he just had to give up his strategic defense initiative. And of course, with it, much more in terms of his policy of opposing the Soviet Union, not propping it up. But Yuri saw all of this from the other side. He was observing it through the lens of a man who was deeply committed and courageously pursuing the end of the Soviet totalitarian regime and system. And we couldn't be more pleased to have him with us to talk a little bit about both his own life experiences and insights into that Reykjavik 1.0 moment, but also the moment we find ourselves in currently, Reykjavik 2.0, perhaps. Yuri, welcome, and over to you, sir.
Thank you, Frank. Well, about my previous experience, I can talk a lot, and we definitely were struggling with the same enemy, the Soviet communist regime, which was much more difficult, frankly, to do from inside the Soviet Union than from the outside. But by Reykjavik, I was already on this side. And actually, I was at the last briefing of President Reagan at White House. I was part of the group which briefed him. So it happened. As independent person, as person who continued to struggle for human rights in the Soviet Union already from the American side, definitely my personal message to Ronald Reagan the day before he left to meet Gorbachev in Reykjavik was about releasing of all political prisoners, which was my main mission. But I was also part of the whole group which came from the main message to Ronald Reagan. I think it was delivered by Dr. Kennedy at that time. And it was, Mr. President, don't give up SDI. And I think that's really was the most important message. And that the fact that Reagan kept SDI and wasn't influenced by those who actually tried to ensure him otherwise. I think this fact made that Reykjavik meeting very successful. And it was a success for the United States or for the free world. And that success was seen soon very clearly when Gorbachev had to make all reforms, and Reykjavik played a very important role in that. And actually, he released all political prisoners. And as we remember, he made such important concessions in arms agreement, which couldn't be expected by American diplomats. Now, the question now is with China. What is today SDI? What America shouldn't give up in communication with Peking? And I don't want to be repetitive, as John already well explained, that first thing is important to recognize that China is our main enemy, that ideological war between communism and America never stopped and never ended. That what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the headquarters of this war simply moved from, and general staff moved from Moscow to Beijing, but there was no disruption, and the war continued all the time, and China all the time was communist country, and to China we always remained enemy number one. It's no doubt about that. And China is our arch enemy now. And that is a fact, you know, and as many people try to call it competitor or someone else, it's not serious. It's our main enemy, existential threat. And what is important, that China is a leader of all totalitarian world, which includes now Russia and Iran and North Korea. And it's a leader and master of this totalitarian regime. So we should hold China responsible for whatever this totalitarian world does and what happens with ideological war. And the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza, which we have now in Israel, are proxy wars of this ideological war. And our demand to China should be to stop it. And we shouldn't consider China as neutral moderator, as sometimes Trump suggests that Ukraine is simply moderator in Russia-Ukraine conflict, and maybe China is also some neutral moderator. We are not neutral, neither of one. We are on just opposite side of this general ideological war and this proxy war. And we definitely are on Ukraine's side, and China is on Russia's side. And it's on Russia's side quite explicitly, with all agreements it made with Russia, with supplying Russia with all modern electronics and chips, which Russia needs to build its missiles and drones, which it uses every day to kill peaceful population in Ukrainian city. So our message should be very clear, and it should be ultimatum. Should be not bargaining point. Stop the war in Ukraine, and definitely our second message should be stop expansion in South China Sea, and keep your hands off Indonesia, Philippines, and first and foremost from Taiwan. And I think that message should be put very clearly and strongly. And after this strength was demonstrated by Trump by bombing sites in Iran, I think it makes his position quite strong to speak in very ultimative terms with Chinese.
Yuri, thank you. I consider this to be truly a God thing that you were able to join us. Your perspective on both what has preceded this immediate meeting and your insights into what needs to be done in the meeting and in the days to come, just of surpassing importance. And so we're very, very appreciative of you taking the time. We're going to hear next from a man who has been a very prominent fixture in these programs, as is appropriate given his rank. He is the chairman of our Committee on the Present Danger China, of which John Linchowski is an important member, as will be our next presenter. We are very appreciative of the leadership that Brian Kennedy has given to this organization from its inception, and especially for the clarity that he brings both to the problem we face from what Yuri has just properly described as our arch enemy, a nation sworn to our destruction under the Chinese communist rule. He has also been a champion of missile defense for many years, and I think was among those who was very, very much of a mind, as was I at the time, in government, as I was, that we needed to not only fully develop and perfect missile defenses, something that was impermissible, by the way, at the time, under the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty of 1972, but we needed to deploy them as well. Another part of the Reagan vision that was ultimately made possible, not fully realized to be sure, but made possible by what the president did at Reykjavik. So we wanted Brian Kennedy to talk a bit about both the context that we've been discussing, but also the importance of missile defense, the importance of Reagan's rejection of the temptation at Reykjavik 1.0, and whether that could in fact be a useful model for President Trump in his meetings tomorrow. Brian, welcome back. It's good to have you. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Frank. Good to be with you. First of all, let me say, when it comes to clarity, I don't think we could be much more clear than what John and Yuri just had to say when it comes to the Soviet Union and now Russia. And this we have formulated this as a comparison to Reykjavik, and I think it's apt at one level, and at another level, it's a much, much different world than the one we have today. That was a much different world than the one we have today. There was a great deal more clarity back then than there seems to be at present. When it came to missile defense at Reykjavik, obviously the Soviet Union, which had a missile defense themselves, didn't want the United States building a missile defense. And they thought they could perhaps get President Reagan to bargain that away. And at some fundamental level, President Reagan realized that that was existential to the United States, that we would have a national missile defense and make sure that we were not held captive to a foreign enemy's nuclear arsenal. And so he didn't bargain that away. And although he didn't bargain it away, we also don't have one today. And that, I think, shows I mean, we have a very limited one, let me say, today, incapable of stopping a Russian or Chinese or Iranian ship-launched ballistic missile aimed at the United States. And so after all these years, there's a kind of moral corruption that we have in this country where we think that we can talk about things and talk is enough, that we don't actually have to do them. We can believe in free trade, and we can give a lot of lip service to the idea that if we have free trade and we have exchanges of technology, that communist China, for instance, is going to become just like us, or other nations in the world are going to become just like us, when in fact those things don't happen. We don't have, a world where everyone believes in freedom and self-government. We have a world where we, in our very imperfect way, are trying to recover freedom and self-government here in America. And we have a world where authoritarianism, totalitarianism is really on the rise. You see it obviously most specifically in communist China, but you have authoritarian regimes obviously in England today where freedom of speech is being curbed for everyday people in Britain who want to speak their mind about the state of their country. So this is a world which is much different, I think, when it comes to just how we see the rest of the world. So let me say that as background for what I'll say about President Trump. I've been a champion of missile defense, but I've also been a champion of President Trump. Very much believe in his leadership and have done everything I could to champion that. He's going here with Xi Jinping with his eyes wide open. He saw, President Trump did, the threat that Xi Jinping made against the U.S. and global economy when he talked about restricting rare earth metals, rare earth minerals, and rare earth magnets. This was a real blow, a real knife at the throat, as it were, as many have said, to the U.S. economy. So President Trump's here because he knows that if we are reliant on communist China for these metals and we're not allowed to get them, then our economy may well suffer. And I think it's worth examining as a nation and explaining to the American people what that might look like. It's a world where these rare earth minerals are used in all sorts of components in our electronics, day-to-day electronics, and in our industrial output. The president's been told that if we don't have access to these rare earth minerals, then the U.S. stock market is going to go down by 50%, and that industrial output is going to be radically cut. And so the president goes into these meetings wondering whether that's true or not. My own view is that if communist China wants to play that game and restrict us from rare earth minerals, we can simply accelerate the decoupling from communist China. Let's be clear that if that's what they want to do, we don't have to live in a world where we're buying any goods from communist China. Will there be pain to the U.S. economy? Yes, absolutely. But if we're going to be, have a gun to our head, as it were, then what kind of an economy is it? That would be number one. Number two would be, even if we make a deal with communist China, they don't believe in deals. They believe that even after you sign something, they can renegotiate it. So they're constantly renegotiating deals. They don't honor any of the trade deals. They steal our intellectual property to the tune of some $1 trillion a year. They're in the United States, as we know, with, allowing fentanyl. They have 200,000 men of military age around the country, many of them running illegal marijuana grow houses. I mean, they're of an age where they could be special forces that could be used to compromise our electric infrastructure, and that could engage in a whole host of nefarious activities. And so when we think of communist China and making deals, I think the first part of the deal is every Chinese national that's been here in the United States, who's come illegally over the last 4 years, needs to be brought home immediately. Immediately. And there won't be a single one in the United States. And we have to reevaluate all the students that are here immediately, because those students are part of a network that steal intellectual property at a rate of, as I say, around $1 trillion a year. All that's outrageous. And so do we have a real trading partner here in communist China? I don't think we do. Does President Trump need these rare earth minerals? Yes. Do we want to engage in trade with communist China? Yes, if they're going to be good trading partners. Can someone really be said to be a good trading partner if they've imported 200,000 special forces in your country, engaged today in nefarious activity, if they have students and other business people and a cyber army back in communist China stealing American intellectual property? I don't think you can say that's a good trading partner. Does President Trump know all this? Yes, absolutely. He's trying to make up for 2 decades of complete incompetence by American politicians and business leaders when it comes to the investments necessary in the U.S. economy, in these rare earth minerals, in American manufacturing, in the kind of things that we need in order to have a modern industrial economy that could compete with a nation like communist China. Can we build a fighter aircraft today without components made in communist China? No. That by itself just means we're living in a country where we have stupid people governing us and making policy decisions that simply are incompatible with common sense. And President Trump knows that, and he's playing catch up. So when we look at the kind of things President Trump says, he's trying to explain this to the American people in a way that doesn't shock them. He has said over and over again that we've not done the right things. He's playing catch up. Let me just say, we can play catch up here. And we are in the process of playing catch up. We're making deals with other countries that have rare earth minerals. We have them in this country. There's some in Canada. There's some in Mexico. They're all over the world. The only question is how long it takes for us to refine those. And I do believe we can get that done. Fundamentally, we're living in a world, I'll close with this. We're living in a world today where there's 2 different views of what the role of communist China should be. President Trump wants American manufacturing here in this country. He wants it for the American people. He thinks it's good for the American middle class. He thinks it's absolutely necessary for the U.S. economy that we have a robust manufacturing base. Communist China, on the other hand, believes that's their job. Our job is to produce intellectual property that then they steal, and their job as well is to be the manufacturing base of the planet. And so they say, we have all these people, we have 1.4 billion people, not sure of that number, but let's just say that's true. Their job is to manufacture. And so they're fundamentally at war with President Trump's economic policy. They don't believe that America should be engaged in any manufacturing. And so they're engaged in these threats, negotiations, what have you, that will keep them as the main manufacturing platform for the United States and for the world. That is something that is fundamentally at odds with President Trump's main economic strategy. And finally, let me say that if they really do want to press this point about rare earth minerals, then it's perfectly possible to decouple with the Chinese economy. President Trump's talked about building freedom cities here in the United States. We have a big country. People live on 6% of the land. If we're not going to have a world where it's all high-tech components and, electronics, everywhere, then we're going to have a more old-fashioned economy where we're actually building things here in this country again. We can spread out. We can build more homes. in brand new cities around the country. We can employ a lot of people by that process. We can get a lot of people into lower cost home ownership that way. And we can have the kind of economy that may not benefit the tech bros and their very hasty drive toward artificial intelligence or an artificial intelligence-based economy. But instead, if we can't go that direction, we can have a more traditional economy of home ownership, manufacturing, construction, and really see what that would look like too. All those things can provide wealth to the American people. We can live here in North America in freedom and prosperity if need be. And the only question is, do we have the political commitment to make that happen? And so, Frank, I think I'm not too worried about what happens with Xi Jinping tomorrow. I think President Trump has a real strategic plan when it comes to the U.S. economy. And whatever you might hear tomorrow, President Trump has a variety of other options that he's pursuing that can be workarounds for whatever short-term concessions we may need to have when it comes to communist China. So thank you, Frank.
Right, thank you. And you've, I think, enunciated very well the difference between the Trump agenda and that of the Chinese Communist Party. The question still to be determined, of course, is exactly how does that translate into, as you say, short-term concessions, perhaps, or maybe even a longer-term shift on President Trump's part towards more engagement rather than decoupling. De-risking, of course, is a term that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, like his predecessor, Janet Yellen, have coined to talk about something that's, I guess, a softer, gentler kind of decoupling. But whatever term you apply, the question is, will we continue to do that or not? And indeed, should we do that? To help answer that question, I'm very pleased to welcome back another of our Committee on the Present Danger of China rock stars. His name is Colonel Grant Newsham, United States Marine Corps retired. Colonel Newsham was, in addition to a distinguished veteran of the Corps, a Foreign Service officer in our embassy in Tokyo. He has also been an entrepreneur and businessman in the region for many years. And in fact, speaking to some of the points that Brian made, he worked for an American company, one of the preeminent American companies at the time, as it sought to, well, engage, I guess is one word for it, or couple with China. That company was called Motorola, and it scarcely exists any longer. And what does exist, I think, is now a wholly owned Chinese enterprise. Colonel, we couldn't be more pleased to have you with us. You have been one of our most faithful contributors to this entire webinar series, and it's all the more laudable because usually it makes you get up in the middle of the night, your time in East Asia, to contribute, but you do so magnificently, and I know you will on this occasion, especially, I hope, by talking a bit about the stakes involved should President Trump yield in to this temptation, and should we, in fact, find ourselves aiding and abetting further the power and the threat of which the Chinese Communist Party is capable against our country and its friends and allies, among other places where you are in the Eastern Pacific. Welcome back, sir. The floor is yours.
Thanks for having me today, Frank. I came dressed as President Zelensky of the Ukraine. So I'll just offer a few comments. There's a tendency to ask, well, should we bail? Well, not a tendency to ask, but a tendency to think, well, let's just bail out the Chinese again. Let's cut a deal that lets us get along, and maybe the Chinese will come around and sort of become like big Canadians at some point. We've been doing this for decades, and it's reached a point, really, I think, where the Chinese not only have got military and economic power and even psychological and political power that they've never deployed the way they have now. Xi Jinping laying down the law on the rare earth exports to the United States is really an act of war. And you can see it is completely back-footed the Trump administration. So they are really restricted in what they can actually do to take on China. And it was a question of prominent US executives coming into the White House and saying, look, if we don't get these rare earths, we're going to have to cut down business, close down our businesses. So that's how strong a hold they've got over the administration. And as Brian Kennedy correctly pointed out, this has been built up over 30 years, and President Trump has now had to, he's the guy with the hot potato who has to try and fix this. So it's going to take some effort. And I think that they are, I think in the meeting with Xi Jinping, I think that the deal's already been cut. And I think they are going to reach some sort of an accommodation where we make some concessions on things like tariffs, probably export controls on certain technology, maybe even on the charges we apply to Chinese ships that come into US ports. And meanwhile, the Chinese will say, well, maybe we won't put on these restrictions on rare earths that we thought. So in effect, I think the administration is playing for time to see if they can get off of the rare earth addiction in particular and create some alternative sources of it. I think they'd take them at least a year, probably a bit longer actually, if they do that. But you might ask, well, what's the problem with just accommodating China this time and not just try to de-escalate, lower the temperature? Well, we've done this over and over, as I said. And what has China done in the process? They've really have built up a military that if it chooses its time and its places to hit us, they would give us a really bloody nose. They've had de facto control of the South China Sea since about 2016, and their capabilities, their power projection capabilities continue to expand at a steady rate. Of course, if we fight off of San Diego, we still got an advantage. But militarily, that the Chinese are providing the resources that they need to build up a military, even while 600 million Chinese live on $5 a day or less. So that's the military problem. Economically, they have unfortunately built themselves into an economy that has this sort of self-sustaining in some respects, and it just has such dominance in certain areas that it gives the Chinese a strength that they have never actually had before. And that's the result of thinking you can always postpone the reckoning with the PRC. But I think there is an awareness in this administration, even though sometimes there seems like there's an ad hoc sort of aspect to the policy towards Asia, towards China. I think that there is actually a concerted plan. And I think that the president and his team do understand that China is a threat that's not going to change, and that America needs to decouple, call it what you will. But I think that is where we're headed. The idea of building up alternative supply chains is partly driven, I think, by the notion that we're not going to be able to do business with the PRC indefinitely. And I think there is a move and a strategy afoot that you don't want to, you can't quite say it. But I think that there is an understanding that needs done, and it is in process. Now, when it comes to war, should we, when you look at this, what the Chinese threat has become, should we be on a war footing? Should we actually set up so that we can fight a war? Well, we'd better. It's not just the Chinese military threat, but also their unrestricted warfare on different fronts. The economic warfare, which has gutted and hollowed out U.S. industry to the point where we couldn't even come close to refilling our arsenals if we get into any sort of a shooting war with a serious opponent. Even supplying Ukraine has dangerously reduced our stocks. And this needs to be done. And the longer we wait, the more trouble we're going to be in. And so this meeting with Xi Jinping is, I think we've reached a point where you can't kick this can down the road any longer. But I think there is an awareness of that. And as I stress again, the Chinese behavior is more aggressive, more assertive than I've ever seen it. And this rare earth cutoff that they've threatened and have actually implemented to some extent is effectively an act of war. Now, what happens at the meeting with Xi Jinping? As I said, the deal's already been cut, and I think we kind of know what's going to happen, with each side sort of keeping their ammunition in reserve. And the Americans, we do have a very good hand to play if we choose to. The Chinese are very good at sort of faking it till they make it. And they do depend on a lot of American technology. They depend on a supply of US dollars that they need to actually buy the high technology that they need to keep their economy running and also to build up their military. So we have a pretty good hand to play if we would actually play it. But one always hesitates to say that we're at an epical moment where things are really changing. But I think we have. And if we decide that we are going to actually start defending ourselves and get on this war footing, that will be sending a very strong message to the Chinese. It's not just a question of does America have the hardware stocks, but the Chinese are always assessing the will of their opponents, of their victims. Are they willing to actually defend themselves? And if we get on that war footing and we do make it clear that we're not going to be addicted to the Chinese market, to Chinese supplies, well, that will be sending a huge psychological message to the Chinese, and they will find that they don't quite know how to respond to that. So when Mr. Trump meets Xi Jinping shortly, I don't think he's going to give away the house, but he's definitely in a position that's weaker than he would like to be, and it's because other people have put him in that, and it's up to us if we actually pull out of it. So this is it's going to be the start of really a very clear demonstration of whether or not America is going to actually do what's necessary to prevail, or if it's just going to keep accommodating the PRC.
Colonel, thank you very much. As always, very much on point. And I think what you've put forward is a rather more optimistic view of all of this than one might expect from the author of When China Attacks, a Warning to America, and someone who has reminded us frequently in the course of these programs just how perilous the military situation is, in particular, as you and Brian both talked about, including here on the home front. In that connection, I would commend to all of our audience some of our previous programming on that point. You can find all of them, some 220, I think now, of these webinars at our presentdangerchina.org website, and I hope you'll subscribe there. Colonel, I mentioned you had worked with Motorola, and we have time for a little bit of Q&A with you and Brian, if you will indulge us. I've heard you say on previous occasions how really iconic a company it was at the time, and how what it did to essentially buy into this notion that we were dealing not with an archenemy, we were dealing with a trading partner, we were dealing with business collaborators that actually resulted in pretty much the demise of the company. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that point? Because to the extent that there is, in fact, pressure within the administration, and I believe that's the case, there may be a plan, there may be a presidential attitude on all of this, yes, but there does seem still to be, not only, of course, there, but in the business elite, the elites, captured elites in academia and media and political affairs. Let's just keep on keeping on attitude. The example of Motorola would suggest we should not keep on keeping on, would it not?
It does. And I say the example of just about every other major company, and even lots of smaller ones that got into China, suggests that the sooner we get away from these people, from this country, the better. Motorola went in with the idea, and with US government encouragement, right after Tiananmen Square, Motorola was effectively the anchor tenant for US investment into the People's Republic of China. So they set up factories, research centers. They did everything the government, both governments, US and Chinese government, told them to do. And that included handing over technology. And what they didn't hand over was, of course, stolen. But the thinking was that, well, if we go into manufacture, do business in China, they'll be happy to have good jobs. and they'll buy Motorola products, and they'll just go from strength to strength. Instead, all they did was they built up their competitors. They allowed the Chinese to develop their own markets that not just rivaled, but surpassed Motorola's. And it was just a question of time. It was a slow suicide that they committed in China. And you look at the experience of every other major company that's gone into China. You find, well, Starbucks just left with their tails between their legs. Just the other day, General Motors is now whining about, well, it's not as profitable as it used to be. And yet they used to swear we're making a ton of money in China. So the purpose when you go into China, the idea is to really sort of loot whatever you've got and destroy you and then have it replaced by a Chinese company. It is that simple. And I don't know what it is they teach at Wharton or wherever to suggest otherwise. But after 40 years of empirical evidence, that's pretty clear. So there is no deal to be cut that is going to allow a sort of a modus vivendi between our two countries. I just don't see that happening. And then I have to point out again, as I always do, that when we talk about reaching a deal, some sort of accommodation with the PRC, the pure insanity of part of it. When you think of it, Chinese fentanyl has killed well over 500,000 Americans since 2012. It's wounded 10 times as many who can no longer function. And we're supposed to do normal business with a country like that. They kill us, they murder us, and we pay them. There's something that just doesn't register. This is, I heard a previous speaker use the word stupidity. I certainly see him and raise him one on that, but say we're at a point where there is no deal to be cut. I think that within the administration, that there's a recognition of it, at least in parts of the administration. But as you note, Wall Street and the American business class, I don't know what it is that's going to actually make them change their minds and actually see the reality of it. I think regular Americans understand it. So I apologize if I gave an optimistic air, but I do think Mr. Trump understands this, and he's got some good people on his team, and the things he has done to try to bring manufacturing back. He's the first one ever that I certainly would support him and would hope that he can pull this off. But what he's done is not just overdue, but it's essential if we're going to survive.
Thank you, Colonel. I didn't mean to sound critical of your optimism, but your apology for it is well accepted. Okay,
I'm sorry.
We got certain standards to keep here at the Committee on the Present Danger, after all. Brian, to the point that was sort of laced into what the Colonel just said, you are, no question about it, one of the most, I think, effective champions of President Trump and his policies, and consequently, you understand as well as anybody some of the dynamics within the administration. There are people who are, I think, self-described as restrainers. I've got different terms for it, but it sounds as though mostly they're interested in retreat, especially when it comes to China. I don't know whether it's come out. I haven't seen it if it has, but it's been imminently to be released for some weeks, if not months now, this so-called national defense strategy. And the reporting on it, whether it's right or not, remains to be seen, but the reporting on it is that it is going to somewhat diminish the perception of China as an adversary in favor of reducing, I guess, the risk that there might ultimately be a possibility of coming to blows with this operation. Could you speak to these sentiments and also, if you could, how the influencers, the lobbyists, the corporate sponsors, the business elites and elites in these other areas are interplaying with such sentiment within the administration? I think you've come to the same bottom line as Colonel Newsham has, that the president will resist all of this, but it does seem to me there's a lot pushing in the other direction at the moment.
That's a good question, Frank. Look, this is also politics at some point, and the president has to make, if he can, a lot of people happy. And he wants to make them happy because they're parts of the economy that are vital to us right now. But that doesn't mean he's going to sell out the whole country to any one group. He just wouldn't do that. For instance, he has a dinner at the White House with all the tech bros, basically the greatest minds from Silicon Valley and elsewhere. And Bill Gates is there, Mark Zuckerberg's there. I don't think they're great minds. They could be evil minds, but they're still there. And he sees those people as a vital part of the economy that have gotten on board for now with the MAGA agenda. So he talks to them and he hears what their concerns are. And they want to use artificial intelligence and other technology to bring America into, a brand new economy. And he hears those things. And to that group, rare earth minerals and the status quo is very important. And then he looks and he talks to the American people and he sees what's important to them. And what's critical to them are jobs, real manufacturing jobs where an American can make money, raise a family, buy a home, and have a future. And whereas those captains of industry from Silicon Valley are doing great, the American people are not doing so great. And the American people for President Trump are a very, very, the highest priority, let's just say. So he's trying to transition the economy from this China almost centric kind of an economy to one that's America centric. And he's trying to make this transition with the minimal amount of dislocation possible. And so he's trying to balance all these facts. And his push toward manufacturing strikes me as, and I think Grant agreed with this, it's the most important thing that he's done. Just the signal we're going to have that kind of an economy is something that matters the most to President Trump. I personally think the Chinese have overplayed their hand here. And whatever deal gets cut in the short run, if communist China is going to hold a knife to our throats, both from denying us access to rare earth minerals, but hold a knife to our throats with, foreign operatives in the hundreds of thousands who've come during the Biden administration who want to live amongst us and commit crimes, or fentanyl, or any of these other new drugs that they're importing into the country. If they're going to do that, you're going to see a decoupling sooner rather than later. And that decoupling will not serve them very well because, yes, they can manufacture a lot of goods, but their own people won't buy those goods. And so they'll still need people around the world to do that. And so if you decouple from the United States, you're going to make us a manufacturing power again. We'll figure out the way to do that. We'll build factories here. All the stuff we get from communist China today, much of which is crap that Americans don't actually need, well, the things we do need will be made here in America. We won't need communist China. You want to deny us rare earth minerals? Fine, we'll get our own rare earth minerals. You want to deny us components for, any of our electronics, what have you? Great, we'll build those here too, or we'll get them from friends and allies. I don't think the Chinese quite understand just how powerful the United States can be when we want to be. And for most of the last 3 decades, we have been governed by people who are, yes, stupid when it comes to our national priorities. We now have a president who understands it. The Chinese are making the bet that the tech bros can talk President Trump out of rebuilding American manufacturing and reorganizing the American economy. That's not going to happen. And so if the Chinese want to push, that'll happen sooner rather than later, where America again will be a manufacturing power, will be self-sufficient, and will be able to rebuild the American military in the ways we ought to. I mean, President Trump has looked at the balance sheet of the United States. He understands we don't have the capacity, industrial capacity, to build the munitions. Yes, we can build ships and fighter aircraft. Can we build them quickly enough? we're going to have a different America if we're going to defend ourselves in the future. And I think the only question is what that transition looks like from being a China-centric type of economy to an America-centric type economy. And as I say, I have a great deal of faith that President Trump knows what that looks like, and we need to have a political class in this country that's willing to join him. And that's where things are less clear. The Republicans and the Democrats in Congress seem to be entirely confused about national priorities. And you have a political class and economic class on Wall Street that also is still part of that China-centric world. So there's a lot of public education to do to get people to understand just what's at stake and just what will be required of them.
Well, that's the business we're in, of course, here at the Committee on the Present Danger of China, is that educational process, Brian, and I thank you again for your leadership in the efforts to bring it to bear with as much impact as possible. We are out of time to explore these issues further for the moment, but we will be returning in the days to come, especially after we have an opportunity to take stock of what goes on at this meeting between President Xi Jinping of China and President Donald J. Trump of the United States in South Korea in the next 24 hours or so. When we do, I know that it will be informed by the best minds that we can bring to bear on the subject, many of whom we're proud to say are part of our Committee on the Present Danger China team, and our friends and associates who've contributed so mightily to these programs. Again, you can find all of them at the committee's website, presentdangerchina.org. And I want to thank our colleague Oleg Abashian, who does such a fabulous job of producing these products and making sure that they are available in a timely way. And he will be doing so in this case as well. Let me just leave you all with a closing thought. Having been present at Reykjavik, at least in the macro sense, I remember vividly coming away from the meeting, as Yuri said, persuaded that it had been a success for the United States, that the impact would be positive for us, for our country, and for freedom around the world. At a moment when I was dispatched after the meeting to go brief our NATO allies about what had come of all of this. And there was a lot of long faces that some great opportunity for a breakthrough and peace with the Soviet Union had been missed. History treated very kindly, I think, in the end, Ronald Reagan's decision not to go for the deal on offer, not to surrender missile defense, not to, once again, buy into the détente policies of his predecessors, which he had very strongly rejected and campaigned against as a candidate, and devised a strategy to supplant. I am with those on our team who very strongly hope that President Trump's vision for an America that is once again undisputably powerful, self-reliant, and capable of defending its own interests as well as those of its allies and friends around the world, and that what we will witness coming out of this meeting, whether it's with the signature of a trade deal or not, will be a reaffirmation that that vision is what this president stands for and seeks to accomplish. And if so, I think it will be clear shortly, if not maybe in the longer term, that this was indeed a Reykjavik moment, and he passed the test, as did my old boss, Ronald Reagan. Those are in my prayers. You all are in them as well. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your support for our efforts. Please, if you are willing to do so, make that support tangible, you can do so at the Institute for the American Future, for example, a donate page there. It sponsors this committee and other work that is, I think, of vital importance to all of us. I so appreciate all of our colleagues that contributed to today's program, and we'll look forward to having the next one in the days ahead with their help as well as yours. God bless you all.